Colleagues, welcome to this meeting. Others will join us during the course of the next hour. But before I welcome formally our guest speaker, can I just notify everybody that this webinar is on the record. It is being recorded and will be uploaded as soon as we can to the CEF website. We'll be using the meeting format. Can I please remind everybody to switch off your microphone and unless you're being called upon to ask a question. And actually, we found from experience that attendees get a better sort of view of this if you switch on speaker view, so you can see exactly what our guest is saying. If you want to ask a question, can you please either raise the virtual hand or use the chat function, and I will then come to you to ask your question live. I will also, at this start, let me get the housekeeping notices out of the way. Upcoming events, 8th of June, we have a reception with Sir John Major. Members ought to have received an invitation by email. If not, please contact us via the office address to ask about this. So that's the 8th of June in the early evening reception with John Major. Mid-June, there will be an event on UK-EU data equivalence, an opportunity for cooperation, and invitations for that will be going out shortly. And then on the 1st of July, sorry, the 4th of July, on American Independence Day, at 6 p.m, there will be the CEF AGM at Mary Sumner House, which was part of the Church House complex. And members should have received an email about this earlier this week. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Aliona Hlivco, our guest for this evening. She's a political risk analyst, works for the Henry Jackson Society, but is also a regular contributor at Chatham House. Before coming to London a few years ago, she had an extensive political career in Ukraine, started as a journalist and campaign manager, went on to become a trustee to a presidential candidate. She was an activist during the Orange Revolution in 2004 and one of the organizers of the Revolution of Dignity 10 years later. After the 2014 war broke out, she became a part of the volunteer movement to help crowdfund for the Ukrainian military, defending them against Russia and Russian surrogates in that conflict. She's been chief of staff to an MP, stood as a candidate for the Ukrainian parliamentary elections, and was elected as an MP in 2015 in the Chernivtsi regional parliament. And she was also a special advisor to the chairman of that parliament. She has received the Order of Merit for significant contribution to democratic developments in Ukraine. I'm going to ask Aliona to speak for as long as she wants, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then I will come to questions. So please do have your questions ready. I will call as many people as I possibly can. Aliona, you're very, very welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much for such a warm welcome, Sir David Whittington. It's my true honor and privilege to be able to speak here, and thank you to the Conservative European Forum for having me, and for the constant and continuing attention to Ukraine and everything that's happening in my home country. The UK has been at the forefront of supporting Ukraine, and I feel almost at home when especially I walk down the Whitehall or the Parliament Quarter and see the Ukrainian flags waving in the sky. So that's very heartwarming in this difficult time. I think I will start off by answering the question that every Ukrainian answers when we speak to each other, whether the Ukrainians abroad or the Ukrainians back home. Apart from asking, how are you and how are all your family and friends? Is everyone alive? That's the first question that usually comes up. The second one is, where were you when it happened? So where were you on the 24th of February? early morning. I was, of course, here in London since I'm based here, but I remember being woken up by several calls from my grandmother, who was in Ukraine and couldn't get through to me. And around 6 a.m. London time, which was already quite late, it was 8 a.m. Ukraine time, she managed to get a hold of me with the words, "Child, wake up, the war has started." And I do remember those being one of the most terrifying words I've ever heard in my life. Since then, I've had several repeated calls from the British media, who previous to that, for a couple of weeks, asked me to be on standby in case anything happens, that I would be ready and available to speak on the war at any time. And I just could not bring myself to answer those phone calls because I just couldn't stop the tears falling down from my eyes and comprehending whatever's happened and trying to figure out where my family is, where there are bombings there. Because on the 24th of February, we heard the bombings going across the whole of Ukraine, including the western regions where I'm originally from. Later, I did find out that there was no bombing in my hometown of Chernivtsi, but it was 2 hours away, just a 2-hour drive in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk. That was the closest. So it was still quite scary. Now we are 3 months into war, and it has become somewhat of a normal reality, even though every day is still a stress. Every day is still waking up to calls from home. Every day is me waking up in the morning and expecting a message from my brother, from whom I get only one message a day saying that he's okay and he's alive, because he is fighting on the front line somewhere. And I can only know that it is somewhere in the northeast of Ukraine. So I presume it's around Kharkiv region, but I can only presume because they're not allowed to disclose their location. In the last 3 months, I had to gather all of my volunteer potential, and with the help of the Ukrainian embassy and the Ukrainian volunteer hub that's been set up in Holland Park, we have managed to send a lot of volunteer aid to Ukraine, amongst which was even the bulletproof vest and the protective clothing and some medical supplies to my brother as well. Everything from thermal underwear to shoes to vest to helmets. So in the beginning of the war, there was almost nothing there. The conscription went through, but Ukrainian soldiers were quite unprotected. So I think about a month into the active war phase, we were basically most focusing our efforts on that. Now it's slightly better. As you can see, the world has united for Ukraine. There are even first mentions that Ukraine can win this war. With Ukraine now being in the second stage of the war and it coming to an end, we even heard the statement from the Secretary General of NATO saying that Ukraine can win this war. We can see the continuous ongoing support from the UK. The US just made an enormous and unprecedented contribution to Ukraine's security that encounters $40 billion of medical, humanitarian, and military aid. We have the land lease agreement that's signed, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. So we are expecting everything to come together. The American military aid, more help from the UK, some more weapons and heavy artillery, long-range missiles from the European countries like Germany and France. In fact, the French Caesars have just arrived to Ukraine, which I've seen many positive feedback from the Ukrainian soldiers on the front line. With all of that coming to Ukraine around late June, August, I think those are the estimates. There is an expectation that the active phase and the most brutal phase of war will come in August. And according to the Chief of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, it will last all the way until mid-autumn, maybe end of the year, with the final end coming around next year. Those were also the statements that were aired by the US intelligence. So those are the estimates now. What is actually going to happen, I think only time will tell. And as we're seeing now, there are certain escalations in the east. And considering what President Zelensky has been saying in the last few days, that Donbass is hell now, and the situation there is dire. After surrendering Mariupol, they have managed to also go after several cities and towns in Luhansk Oblast. So it seems like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Popasna, if not have fallen already, they might fall quite soon. We can see advances being made in Donetsk region. So it seems like Russian forces are making some advancements in the east. At the same time, it's being reported today that Putin signed a decree that allows or facilitates the residents of occupied territories of Zaporizhia region and of Kherson and Mariupol to obtain Russian passports quite easily. So the effective annexation of the occupied territories of Ukraine has started. Now, the reason why they're trying to perform that act is I think they have seen that some of the attempts to stage another referendums to create the quasi-republics, as they've done successfully in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, 2015, they've seen those attempts failed. People did not show up to referendum in the necessary amount in Kherson 3 times, according to Ukrainian intelligence. So they just decided to go ahead and incorporate the occupied territories straight into Russia. And there's also information that Kherson might get incorporated into the administrative region with Crimea into the same admin region that is going to be called Tavriskaya Gubernia, so the province of Tavria, which is a historical geographical name for the south of Ukraine. So we can see their advances happening there, and I presume they're trying to grab as much as they can now before all of the Western weapons and military aid has come into Ukraine. They're trying to secure their positions now as far as they can. When it comes to Mariupol, it has surrendered to Russia. Mariupol port is under Russian control as well, with 4 foreign flagships being stranded there. There are other 3 seaports of Ukraine that are under Russian control. The rest are still under Ukrainian control, but of course we know that over 70 foreign flagships are stranded in Ukrainian ports. And there is a global food crisis that is emerging as we speak now, with exports not being able to be facilitated from the Ukrainian ports. We all know the problem of Ukrainian grains getting stuck in those ports or being stolen by Russians. There have been several reports of Ukrainian grains being stolen by the occupants and transported from Crimea, the port of Sevastopol, into the Mediterranean Sea to several countries. There were several countries that refused to accept that transport, the vessels that were carrying stolen goods, but other ones have accepted it, sadly. So the situation there remains quite difficult, and Russia is only agreeing to liberate Ukrainian ports and provide some sort of humanitarian convoy to those ships in return of some concessions being made in terms of sanctions against Russia. All of that is creating a very difficult situation for Ukraine. We have seen many contradicting allegations, statements, op-eds, editorials, and opinions in Europe and in the US recently, saying that winning this war for Ukraine is untenable, it's impossible, and it's foolish to even hope for that Ukraine must give into some sort of concessions, give up on certain territories in order to have peace in Europe. And I think we can discuss this further because I'm sure there will be many questions regarding that, especially when it comes to particular countries in Europe, maybe the ones that were involved in the Minsk agreements to begin with, the Normandy format, all the contradictory decisions that were made there, why Ukraine did not fully comply with them, where it led today, and why Ukraine will not agree to any of those concessions. And it is important to understand that appeasement doesn't work. I think we've seen that in the Second World War. We've seen that in 2008 in Georgia. We've seen that with Moldova. We've seen that even in 2014-15 in Ukraine, but unfortunately those lessons have not been learned either. And now going back to the same narrative seems not only foolish, but quite surprising for me personally, because it looks like the world just doesn't learn the lessons that it needs to learn in order to avoid for these situations to reoccur in the future. And I think with that, I'll leave it at that. There's so much more that we could discuss, but I would rather switch to Q&A and see what actually interests the audience. Would be happy to engage in a conversation.
Aliona, thank you very much indeed. And can I invite colleagues to, again, show that they wish to ask a question either by raising the virtual hand or by putting something into the chat facility. I'm going to go first to John Bowis, please.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Aliona, for that moving and quite personal talks you've given us about how you're seeing events in Ukraine. I'd like to ask a little bit about the public opinion there and the way the political movements in the past have moved since the run up to the invasion and since. Because I can remember being in Ukraine and the public opinion was fairly balanced. And if we saw this in some of the early elections, which went both ways, the pro-Russia party, the pro-Europe party. And I wonder if that has now been knocked on the head by Mr. Putin himself, and whether public opinion now is a big majority against any alliance with Russia or any involvement with Russia, and how you see that public opinion moving on, particularly as we come, as we hope, to the end of the invasion, and whether you see at that point a wish to rebuild connections across both directions, or whether this has done permanent damage and Ukraine will be hostile to Russia and its allies as far ahead as we can see.
Aliona?
I think to start answering your second question, that is exactly what is being decided right now as we speak. With the negotiations and the potential calls to reach some sort of agreement for ceasefire and leave the situation practically as is, that will not provide any resolution. And the reason why I say that is not simply because I'm Ukrainian and I care deeply for my country. We need to draw lessons from history. And we have seen previously that Russia has already been appeased with the Minsk agreements, where Ukraine kind of gave up or forgot about Crimea. We agreed to these republics being formed in the East, the so-called republics that were created and run by Russian proxy. And we thought that that will be a stalemate that will help us incorporate the separatist movement republics into Ukraine with wider rights that they could achieve. In reality, that didn't happen. Russia started giving away Russian passports to the citizens of occupied territories, the ones who were left on the territory, because 2 million people fled the country and became the regions and became IDPs in the country, mostly in Kharkiv and Kyiv. And it was actually really sad because so many of those refugees who settled in Kyiv and Kharkiv after 2014, they were fleeing this time the war again. And this time the active, aggressive war from Russia that they were facing, and they ended up in my hometown. My grandmother, for example, hosted 3 families from around Kharkiv and Zhytomyr, and they were saying that it just seems that they cannot get away from Russia. So just to go back to your question, this will not stop until Russia is defeated. As sad as it sounds, I think Russia needs to be defeated in all senses of this word, almost similarly to the way that Germany was defeated after the Second World War. It needs to understand what it has done in full capacity to the world, of how dangerous these fascist and xenophobic allegations are, what this policy of aggression and imperialism basically leads to, and that the world does not tolerate it. If we let it slip once again, when Russia saw that nothing really happened after 2014, and they can go on and embark on a full-on war in 2022, if we appease Russia now and say even all the allegations that Putin has cancer and he's going to die within the next several years and there's going to be a regime change in Russia, they will simply not learn those lessons. So only the complete and total defeat of Russia now, sadly, will lead to them changing their stance and reviewing generally their attitude towards the world and their space in this world.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Asia Odriozola next, please.
All right. Oh, Aliona, the first thing before I ask you my question is to say that I agree with you 100% that Russia needs to be defeated, as you explained, hands down, for many reasons, but 100% behind you. Now, my question is, you mentioned before about August, and August being so crucial in terms of escalation. Can you please elaborate a bit on that? What do you think that's so?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Azir, for your question and for your opinion. So there were certain allegations by military experts, I wouldn't say allegations, probably analysis is a better word, that Russia, having lost a lot of military equipment, a lot of soldiers, and kind of running low on the resources, that they are now going through a covert conscription. So they're mobilizing additional soldiers from across the country, but they're trying to get contract soldiers, and they're trying to not announce full mobilization. That's why that effort is much slower. And firstly, it was kind of elaborated on the fact that the active stage in the war will resume mid-June. After they're having captured east of Ukraine, like they're doing now, they will need to regroup a little bit because the resources are running low. So the active military stage for them will start in June. With Ukraine seeing how the provision of military weapons is being conducted now, it seems that, because, you know, when Germany even said that they're going to provide their tanks sometime mid-July with all the processes and procedures, there was quite a backlash in Ukrainian society. But we can now see realistically that with the Lend-Lease, all the long-range missiles that are being sourced for Ukraine now globally, with all the military conferences, the Rammstein and Rammstein II held in Germany. With all the timeline, it seems like Ukraine will have the full provision of those weapons sometime from the end of July to beginning of August, mid-August. And that is when the Ukrainian military intelligence is expecting to start counteroffensive, basically. And I presume that they're counting on starting it on all fronts, including perhaps the naval front as well, considering that we're getting NSMs with the help of Norway and the UK, and we're getting the long-range missiles. So we might expect counteroffensive going on in the south and in the east, and liberating those territories. So I think that's what stood behind the Ukraine's intelligence statements on full-scale resumption of military actions mid-August.
I'm going to come next to Nicholas McLean.
Thank you very much, Aliona. You mentioned Odessa in passing and also several times naval possibilities. I wondered if you could clarify further how the West could be most helpful to Ukraine in breaking the Russian blockade. And this, you mentioned particularly British anti-ship and Norwegian anti-ship missiles, but there are many other countries that should be helping, and there are many countries which are dependent on Ukrainian wheat who should be supporting a naval initiative. How do you see it developing?
Thank you, Nicholas. That is actually a question that is number one on the agenda, I think, for the international community to resolve. Firstly, it's been in long discussions with Norway for them to provide their, in a sense, their anti-ship missiles, and I think that agreement has now been reached. Also, there are active discussions that the UK is leading with the Joint Expeditionary Force and the 10 countries of the northern flank of Europe, including some NATO countries. And there have been serious discussions there of supporting Ukraine, including with long-range missiles. And I think after, if I'm not mistaken, after Ben Wallace visited Lithuania last week within this JEF trip, and sending additional troops, I believe it's 180 troops that are of the UK troops that are being sent to Lithuania. There's also talks about supporting Ukraine to deblock the Black Sea. Now, how that's going to be done, that's a totally different question, because we have already seen the UK saying that they will not be sending, for example, their naval ships into the Black Sea waters, which I can certainly understand considering the constant Russian allegations now and one of the tools of their propaganda saying that they are actually fighting NATO, they're not fighting Ukraine per se. And if they see any NATO boots on the ground, or let's say ships in the waters, that they might be provoked to use nuclear weapons. So that's a very careful decision to be made. On the other hand, it seems like the long-range missiles is for now the closest to what the Western countries can provide. The UK is hard in that front. The US will also be sending a lot of their heavy artillery for Ukraine to help tackle that. And that will, I think when it comes to mid-August especially, it seems like the Ukrainian military will be targeting the so-called Crimean Bridge, that connects land Russia to Crimea, that's been built after 2014 annexation of the peninsula. And I am not sure about the ships. According to the UK Ministry of Defense, there are about 20 military Russian vessels in the Black Sea waters, including two submarines, which were Russian initially, and one Ukrainian one that they have captured. And I've just seen reports from Crimea that one of the Russian submarines just is now currently getting nuclear missiles on board. So that is, of course, another mechanism or tool of Russia kind of wading the Western partners off of this path to help unblock Black Sea and help Ukraine provide grains to the world, because as I'm sure we all know, Ukraine is one of the major providers for the UN World Food Program. We are, I believe, the fourth wheat supplier of the world, in barley and sunflower oil and fertilizers. So with everything being blocked, and especially with another harvest coming up in August again, and we still have all the grain in the warehouse, whichever has not been stolen, it seems like the problem is coming up. Now, Ukraine with the G7 regulation, and I heard that that's been discussed in Davos quite heavily as well, they are now talking about finding alternative routes for Ukrainian grains. The arrangements have already been made for transportation of that grains through 2 Ukrainian ports in the Danube Delta, so that would make it easier. They would exit through Danube, which is southern to the mined waters of northwestern Black Sea, and they will go into Romanian and or Bulgarian ports. But that doesn't nearly meet the supply that we have of grains. So there needs to be a resolution of unblocking the Black Sea. It doesn't seem like Russia is willing to do that. And I think one of the ways to prevent the West from engaging militarily is, again, saber rattling, which they do best, and fear mongering with their nuclear missiles being loaded onto submarines. But realistically, I think it's going to be a matter of negotiations at best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a question from Oliver that I shall go to next. I've got sort of plenty of questions I can ask, but can I encourage other colleagues, please, to signal if they want to ask questions as well, either the chat facility or the blue virtual hand, please. Oliver.
Hi, Aliona. Hi. So insightful, interesting. Yeah, my question is, so if eventually a peace settlement is reached with Russia, do you foresee there being the will amongst the people, the government, to seek EU membership or even NATO membership, or is it too early to say just now? Thank you.
I think certainly, thank you, Oliver. Certainly, we are seeking the EU membership. As you've probably seen, Ukraine has filled in the questionnaire in record time frame and is really pushing for that membership. And I have seen the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister saying on Twitter today that she's out in Europe for weeks of talks with various European leaders until they actually decide and make a final decision on and reach the unanimity on Ukraine joining the EU. As we know, there's a meeting coming up at the end of May, 30th, 31st of May, which I'm sure that's what the effort is aimed at. Whether Europe is willing, ready, and able to have Ukraine now, that's a totally different question. And I will leave that to the European bureaucrats, of course, but it seems like there is a risk. We had an extremely warm and engaging conversations and visits and support from the European Commission and from Council of Europe, of course, and they have been the greatest supporters of Ukraine, saying how Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen said many times that Ukraine is now fighting this war for the rest of Europe, that we are carrying the torch of freedom. But nonetheless, all of those great statements don't always lead to concrete results. Ukraine has been at the fight for democracy for the longest time, ever since 2004. When I was a 17-year-old student on the barricade of revolution, I remember chanting for Ukraine joining the European Union eventually. That's why we stood for fair elections, for transparency, democracy in our country. That's why we went through a painful decommunization in the country, which was an effort because the older generation is still living in that era, and it caused a lot of friction in the society. But nonetheless, now Ukraine is united more than ever, even more than in 2014 during the Revolution of Dignity that actually occurred and was provoked by then President Yanukovych not signing the EU association agreement and refusing to do that. So Ukrainian people literally just went out onto the streets until the president fled the country and the new one signed the agreement. So we are very determined in our aspiration to join the European Union, and I think I will not say we are worthy, maybe more worthy than someone else, but I think Ukraine has definitely proved by actions and by enormous sacrifice that Ukrainian people have done to be part of the greater European community. And I don't think that should cause any questions that have been asked so many times and for so many years in European corridors. So do we want to provoke Russia? Is that going to be okay? Are we going to ruin some sort of status quo? And is that maybe their territory of influence? I think all of that rhetoric that was actually infiltrated into Western minds and hearts through various means, including lobbyism, propaganda, and maybe giving away some lucrative jobs at the retirement of certain European politicians in Russian gas companies. I think that rhetoric should definitely take a step back, and Ukraine deserves to be a part of the European Union. In terms of NATO, I'm really not sure. It seems like NATO as an entity is not involved in war at all. We see a lot of support bilaterally coming from the countries that are NATO members, but we don't see NATO as a united front in Ukraine. And on one hand, I do understand that that's a very smart approach to counter Russian propaganda and to not let them have any excuse to claim that they're actually fighting NATO or that they now have to use nuclear weapons or anything like that. But we're also seeing massive reluctance, and it's not improved since 2008, when Ukraine was rejected NATO membership and MAP plan. It hurts a little bit seeing how NATO is welcoming Finland and Sweden very swiftly and promptly and no questions asked. Although it is reassuring that the world is uniting around one idea of being protected against aggressors of this world. But it seems like Ukraine also could benefit of it being membership of that alliance. And if not, which most likely, I don't know, I can't speak for NATO, but what I'm seeing now, Ukraine might never become a member of NATO, and that's why the Ukrainian administration is discussing this security agreement with certain guarantors of Ukrainian security, not akin to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, but with actual legally binding guarantees that Ukrainian territorial sovereignty and integrity will be upheld, and that we will have ratified by these states' parliaments agreement that we have some sort of protection against any aggression. I think if we have that at this point, that will suffice if we don't get NATO membership.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question on a similar theme from Martin Smith.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's just a question on that EU accession point is, you may have covered it in your response, but how do you assess the reaction of some countries to Ukraine's application, which is not necessarily hostile, but just simply saying, there's an accession procedure that has hundreds of steps, 100,000 pages of the acquis communautaire. It takes a number of years. Is that some kind of, just sort of stubborn insistence on legal process, or is it kind of hiding some other reservations or reticence, do you think? And how would you overcome it?
I think seeing certain countries expressing their views about Ukraine, especially at the time of war, definitely raises a lot of questions about the genuineness of those allegations. Are they really concerned about the success of the EU as the union? Certainly, European Union has gone through a lot of various issues when it had even the latest two members join the European Union. It has not been easy, neither for the new members, the latest ones being Bulgaria and Romania, nor for the whole of community. There have been many economical issues and troubles that the EU had to go through. And certainly Ukraine is not looking to add to that. But if you look at Ukraine and all the potential and resources it has, it definitely has a lot to offer. And I'm not going to mention the agricultural potential, but also the natural resources, the massive gas transportation system that Europe actually desperately needs and will need even after this whole conflict over gas and oil with Russia will resolve itself, and whether it's going to be the renewables like hydrogen within the new hydrogen strategy that's taken over the EU, that could also be provided via Ukrainian GTS, the gas transportation system, and the internal storage that we have. But all of that aside, I'm sure that it's not easy to get another country, especially the country who is at war, and incorporated into a somewhat nicely functioning, established union of united both by political, economic, financial, and cultural ideas. However, I do think that the European Union, the European Commission, they're going to invest and contribute to Ukrainian rebuilding and redevelopment after this war, even when everything is over, so much that it will only benefit if it has even that legal framework of having an accountable member state who knows concrete lines along which they have to work. And it will only make things easier for the European Union if Ukraine is incorporated into it, because we're going to collaborate and work together regardless. When it comes to certain countries that makes those statements, again, as I've said, I understand the genuine concern, but if the concern is not genuine, and we've seen many countries, which I'm not going to name, but we've seen many countries who are basically voicing and regurgitating the messages that were created in Kremlin for one reason or another. There are still various political movements in every single country. All those countries are still democracies, and all of the politicians, whoever come to power or whoever are in opposition, they get their voices being heard. They have the right to voice their opinions and say what they feel like. But I do feel like the decision on behalf of European Union has to be made pragmatically, and the effort and the sacrifice that Ukraine has made so far needs to be recognized, because it's been way bigger than probably any other countries in Europe.
Thank you. Roy Perry.
Yes, good evening, and Aliona, thank you very much for your presentation. I saw a little of Ukraine's commitment to democracy when I was in Ukraine in 2004 at the time of the Orange Revolution, and went down to Dnipro. You're absolutely right. It's about appeasement. The question I really want to ask is how do you feel the Ukraine economy is going to cope with present wartime situation? I mean, you know, we look with horror at what's happening in cities and towns, and I just wonder how even the British economy would survive if it was facing this sort of aggression in large parts of the country. And I just wonder how you think Ukraine is coping with that, and what we all could be doing more to help.
Thank you, Roy. It's very nice to hear that you've been to Ukraine and kind of saw the transformations that Ukraine was going through and was about to actually face and go on this enormous journey that still hasn't ended even now with our democratization. When it comes to Ukraine's economy, it's a very tough question, because it could have collapsed so many times. For now, it's shrunk enormously. And I think we have more predictions of Ukrainian economy shrinking, the GDP losses. 70% of our customs revenue is lost because Black Sea ports being closed. And of course, it's taking its toll that business in the east of Ukraine, which was heavily industrial area with all the steelworks, the coal mines, and the ones that contributed to Ukrainian budget the most, they're basically out of operation now and don't function anymore. So we have a huge loss of income to budget. And I think President Zelensky even mentioned that Ukraine is currently, one day of war in Ukraine costs $5 billion to Ukrainian economy. $5 billion a day of losses. And I presume that's covering all losses in economy, in growth, in income, and in destructions. But that's a substantial amount. And I think when the European Commission made its decision to contribute 9 billion euros to Ukraine, that was exactly for those purposes, to help the Ukrainian economy keep running and to get some sort of cash into the country and the revenue flow. So I don't know if we're going to manage it. I think with the help of Western partners, the EU including, which has been a great help to Ukraine in this time, and another 40 billion approved by the United States, even though it's mostly military help, which is very much needed, it would also tackle some economic issues. So I think the world is united around helping Ukraine to maintain its economy until we get to finally rebuilding the country. For now, I know that situation on the ground, hryvnia, the national currency, is still upholding somewhat to the level that it was. For example, in comparison to pound, at the beginning of the war, it was 1 to 35. So 35 hryvnia to 1 pound. Now that number is, of course, significantly different. I think it is 46, 47. So it's still not dramatically different, but we can see the impact. The prices have gone up tremendously. There is a shortage of oil in the country and fuel, of course. So economic situation is quite difficult as well. And the government is trying to get some payments in to normal citizens. I've heard that they're giving away like single donations and tranches to some people who are struggling the most right now, and to refugees especially. That aid is coming from the direct Western contribution. So that's very helpful. But I think that as soon as the war is over and we get to reconstruction of Ukraine and rebuilding everything, all of the infrastructural projects will and have the potential to bring Ukraine back on its feet quite quickly. And by quickly, I mean several years, but still, I think that influx of foreign investments will make whatever it's supposed to do and make the biggest difference.
Thank you. Simona.
Thank you very much, Sir David and Aliona, for your open and honest views. I have some issues with the video, but anyway, I hope you will be able to hear me. And I always appreciate that also. I'm the Slovenian ambassador here in London, that ambassadors have also a possibility to take part in these discussions. Aliona, you talked about the complete defeat of Russia, that only that will enable to move forward, to live in peace and in progress. And as I put it in a chat, war always ends with the negotiations, and we cannot deny it. So what do you think? Is peace possible if it's not negotiated with the enemy, with Russia? Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. It's very nice to hear from you. And I think you're very right in your statement that the war always ends with negotiations, because that's what President Zelensky said, I think, just today or even yesterday. And it must end at the negotiations table. However, we do know that Russia will only act in most honest and reliable way at that negotiations table when they're defeated, when they see that their economy is on the verge of collapse or has collapsed, when they see that they have become a total pariah state in the world, that they have no friends left backing their atrocities in Ukraine, and when they see that they have no more military potential. And I wouldn't be even afraid of saying that they must also give up their nuclear weapons if they pose such a threat to the world and use it against the world to threaten with nuclear war at every single chance that they have. When they see that they have no other way out, and there is no more military potential left in them, and the world actually is not falling for their threats, I think that's when we will be ready to sit down at the negotiations table and discuss everything and every potential way how this war can be ended. And by that, I will also relay Zelensky's words that the war can only be ended when Ukraine regains control over all of its territories, including Crimea, when we have reparations paid by Russia, and when we have investigations for the war crimes in Ukraine. Otherwise, that is not going to be considered the end of the war. Now, just to put in a caveat in that, Ukrainians are also not naive, and we're not expecting that, you know, all of a sudden everything will be a one big victory and it will all end in happy ending. I think we're ready for some tactical victories as well. And if that means Russia retreating to the borders of the 23rd of February, withdrawing all their troops and sitting down at negotiations table at that point to discuss how we're going to regain the rest of the territory, liberate Crimea in a non-military way, if they would like, then we can take this discussion further. But again, I will reiterate the point that unless they feel defeated, they will not be able to embark on that honest and open dialogue with the world, because they're just simply not used to it.
Aliona, can I just press you a little bit further on this? It seems to me it's a really important question that Simona, the Slovenian ambassador, raised. We're hearing today that the Ukrainian military are saying that in some parts of Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast, the Russians now outnumber the Ukrainian forces by up to 7-1 in admittedly a much more limited area of territory than at the start of the war. And it's hard, I find it hard to see how even the most admirable and professional defense of Ukraine by the Ukrainian military makes it possible for Ukraine to take back those cities that the Russians have occupied and fortified, given that I'm assuming Ukraine would not adopt the terrorist tactics of the Russians and simply use artillery to kill civilians indiscriminately and flatten cities. And so it's not the reality that for at least the foreseeable future, Russian forces will remain in occupation of parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. And is not the logic, therefore, of what you said about how one moves towards a negotiated settlement, that would need a pretty far-reaching change of political leadership in Moscow, not just for Putin personally to go, but for a very different type of leader to take over. And given that Putin appears to have built his sort of the people around him in the Kremlin in his own image, you know, they're not renowned for independence of thought. How do you see any signs? Is there any reason for optimism about a change of that type coming about within Russia? And if not, is the reality that all of us need in the democratic world to prepare ourselves for this to be a long drawn out conflict, which will require us to commit to military support and economic support in a big way to Ukraine, not just for months, but probably for years?
Yes, David, that is a very fair point. And I think the US intelligence was the first one to say that the world should prepare for the long, protracted war in Ukraine going well into next year. As I've previously said, the Ukrainian Chief of Defense Intelligence followed up on that, saying that yes, the active military operations in Ukraine will last until sometime in mid-autumn and coming to an end by the end of the year. So that is quite a long and protracted war. And certainly Ukrainians will never reside to those tactics that you mentioned and blow up its own cities and towns, just because that's not the way we lead war. And the lives of our soldiers and of our residents and citizens of those cities are still a priority for us. And even as you've seen with Mariupol and giving up the Azovstal battalion to Russians and compromising on that, just shows the Ukraine's approach. That if we need to take a step back in order to save lives, we're willing to do that, regroup, and go back into fighting. Now, the reason for optimism, of course, perhaps might not be that obvious, but when you're a Ukrainian, you kind of have to find those reasons, otherwise you won't get anywhere in the world. And I think we've proved that with the very first stage of this war, with the seizure of Kyiv, that actually we successfully fought off. Currently in Ukraine, there are about 150 Russian battalions that are situated in Ukraine, including the east of Ukraine. And you're right, some of them have fortified their positions in many little cities and towns. And I think as we speak, they're going to close off the Luhansk region completely and gain full control over that. And shortly within the next few days, probably the Donetsk region as well. The Ukrainian armed forces, however, are leading counteroffensive in Kherson region. And maybe if they won't be able to retake Kherson anytime soon, we might be slowly, bit by bit, gaining control back over some of the Kherson region territories. And I think when it comes to optimism, maybe that is why the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence is saying that the active phase of war is going to happen mid-August, going back to that statement, because that's when we will realistically have all the military weapons that the West has now talked about and has confirmed that it is going to be sending it to Ukraine. We currently have 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers conscripted and fighting. So 700,000 of Ukrainians now, with the potential to mobilize up to 1 million of Ukrainian soldiers briefly. That's the number that's been discussed recently. So I think that still gives us quite a big potential to fight back. And with the Western weapons coming in summer, that will definitely give us another breath of fresh air and regrouping and the possibility to fight back. In terms of Western engagement, I'm not so sure, although I did hear some opinions from Western military experts saying that perhaps the West talking about unblocking the Black Sea and sending long-range missiles to Ukraine and maybe using the prevention of global food supply crisis as an official reason to get involved in this conflict in one way or another, that might be a way in for the West to actually physically start participating in the conflict. But then the next day we saw a statement made by the UK that there will be no UK warships or any vessels in Black Sea waters. So I think that's the decision that's still being made. Every day brings something else, and there are various opinions in the US. And I think because we hear about continuous and sustainable support from the West, that's why we start hearing contradictory opinions from other thought leaders like Henry Kissinger saying that Ukraine should just give up, like the constant proposals for Ukraine to reach ceasefire by Italy, constant urges to negotiate, of course, traditionally by France, and Germany. So there are various opinions on this front, but I think the fact that we're getting many opinion pieces published these days just say that perhaps, and I'm not referring that to all of the countries that I've just mentioned, but perhaps Russian lobby is actually actively working right now on trying to stall that resupply of Western weapons to Ukraine, because maybe they're not as optimistic about winning this war as they'd like to be. And that's why they're pushing as quickly as they can right now to give away as many passports as they can to annex territories of Ukraine while they have this momentum, because they do have it now, but it's not going to last long.
Aliona, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening and for answering such a wide range of questions. But actually, we thank all our speakers, but I think that this evening, I think on behalf, I'm sure, of everybody who is listening in and those who were unable to join us tonight but wanted to say something else, which is how much admiration there is in the whole of the UK, and ranging right across party politics, for the heroism that the leaders and people of Ukraine have shown and continue to show in resisting the aggression from Putin's Russia. I have been very struck when I've traveled around our own country to see the Ukrainian flags in little towns and villages many miles from London, in beach cafes, on the top of hills, in cut out of newspapers and put into people's windows and door windows. And I think that that is a measure of how both Ukraine's plight, but also Ukraine's heroism has cut through to people here in the way that very, very few international issues do. So I hope I can leave you with that message and a feeling of the confidence that from this group of Conservatives, but also much more widely in the UK, there is full support and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you very much for the time you have spent with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and indeed thank you to all of the people of Great Britain. As you said, I did see those flags also very far away from London, and that is extremely heartwarming and deeply, deeply appreciated in Ukraine.
Thank you. All the very best to you. I declare the meeting closed.